is Mark Gunn Media.
Hit it!
Welcome to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. I'm your host, Mark Gunn. The views expressed on this program are those of the host and guests and not necessarily reflective of anyone or any entity associated with this broadcast. This episode brought to you by Before Your First Gig, an audiobook written by Steve Dustcircle and produced by Mark Gunn Media. If you're a beginning musician, this is a primer that you'll definitely want to hear. Tips and strategies for setting yourself up for live performances and paid gigs. Before Your First Gig by Steve Dustcircle. Available now on iTunes, Audible.com, and Amazon. Before Your First Gig by Steve Dustcircle. Produced by Mark Gunn Media. This episode, From White America to White America, a much-needed conversation. Quick disclaimer, this is going to offend some people and I'll be accused of speaking in generalities. I'm not. This episode is targeted to a very specific group of white people. Not all. Now, having said that, some of you will still get your knickers in a twist, as the British say, and I'll leave that for you to deal with. Now, if you're someone who'll listen to this in its entirety, please share this with your friends, family, or anyone you really think could benefit from hearing this. In all the years that we as black people have been trying to get this country to understand that the issue of race is still a big problem, despite incremental progress, we're pretty much where we've always been. Blacks are in a constant state of rage, and whites in a constant state of delusion and denial. And some whites continue to ask, why are we still talking about race?
To me, what racism looks like is calling to see an apartment and turning on my phone voice and showing up at said apartment and getting excuses as to why it's no longer for rent.
Every cop car that drives by me, my blood pressure rises. There's an automatic, fear that grips me.
It looks like being told generation after generation what it means to survive in a black body.
When you look at movies and TV shows and whatever, you still have the choice black character or the choice brown character who's head snapping or whatever, that's still a caricature of what blackness is or isn't.
When you walk down the street, people are afraid of you, and you get so used to it sometimes that you even miss it because it's just so much a part of life.
I don't know if I'm going to make it home, right? Anytime a police officer goes by, I'm always having to look over my shoulder. It's that lack of safety.
I had a boss once say, well, you know what, girlfriend, that is not what I did on the weekend, And I kept thinking, do you really talk to everybody like that? Is that how I speak?
No, it hasn't changed. It's just different.
I don't think that it's gotten better. I think that it's gotten more PC because people don't want to be perceived as racist.
They don't want to admit it, and they don't want to be called out on it, and they want to be able to sort of live their lives and sort of get away with it.
It messes with my ability to be able to provide for my family.
A group of white people might be sitting around talking, and they'll be talking about black people in a very objectifying or distancing kind of way. We are talking about them. And I don't think that they necessarily realize that that I'm included in that them category.
We're seeing resources pulled from our schools and our school systems where our black and brown kids are being educated, allowed to fail. We're seeing more police in our communities because we're thought to be inherently criminal.
The idea that it took so much to just get a Confederate flag down, a sign of racist, intention and behavior. If it was that hard to take that flag down, imagine how hard it is to eliminate racism and racist ideologies.
Our children's deaths don't mean anything. You disrespect our elders, you trample on our traditions, you love everything that we produce, but you don't love the people who produce it.
You've heard the arguments. You've seen them on social media. I've had it said to me on countless occasions.
Just stop talking about race. You are the one that's keeping racism alive.
Why does everything have to be about race?
You always play the race card.
If you don't like it, go to another country.
The idea that talking about race or racism is thus perpetuating the problem is absolutely ridiculous. You can't fix a problem without talking about it.
And you're being racist just by talking about racism. All of them diversions from the actual discussion being held at the time. Meanwhile, we have to deal with the parking lot Patties, barbecue Beckys, and every other racist white person who has a problem with us shopping while black, driving while black, getting coffee while black, walking while black, hell, just being black while being black.
White America has been raised to believe, frankly, that black lives matter less than white comfort. When a white person calls the police on a person of color over a barbecue in a park, sleeping in a common room at Yale, sitting at the Starbucks or whatever it is, knowing that Tamir Rice's life was snuffed because someone called the cops on a 12-year-old boy playing with a toy gun. Something that white boys do all across this country without fear of being shot. And that's a national story. You can't tell me you didn't know that happened. When John Crawford is called, the cops called on him at the Walmart, and he's standing there with an air rifle that he pulled off the shelf at Walmart. He's talking to his girlfriend or whatever, and the cops are called on him. They come, they shoot him. When you know that is what happens, what you are saying is, my discomfort with you right now is worth more than the potential that your life could be snuffed in 10 minutes. Until that stops, nothing is going to change.
And what's more frustrating is that we capture it all on video. You're finally seeing what we've been telling you about for decades, and some of you still don't believe it.
The first step for any racist is to deny that racism exists.
Look, I get it. No one wants to be called a racist, even if they do engage in racist behavior, or, as we saw in the midterm elections, have no problem with electing racists to public office. Yeah, you may not be racist, but you're sure as hell racist adjacent. The fact that Donald Trump is president speaks volumes. This country needs to come to grips with some undeniable facts.
Racism is more American than baseball. It was 200 years old before baseball was invented in this country, right? And I go through this every time. The international slave trade, the institution of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and on and on and on existed before baseball did. So it is part of our history. It still reverberates today, and it needs to be addressed.
The United States of America has always been and continues to be a racist nation.
The white people are racist, not all of them. But white culture is, our white country is, our nation is, our American culture is full of white supremacy. And we live in a white supremacist culture that caters to white people. Everything from the media to education to art to culture to politics is whitewashed. This country was built for white people.
You only need to look at the history that you insist on covering up to bear that out.
Carol Anderson, who is a scholar at Emory University, wrote this brilliant book this last year called White Rage. And what she talks about how is in every era of American history, when people of color have made certain progress forward, particularly for black folks, there has been this, what Van Jones called on election night on CNN, white lash, right? But she calls it white rage. And she traces it. You know, you look at the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation era, Reconstruction, what happens? There are all these steps forward. The Supreme Court then guts those programs, and then we have the birth of the Klan. We have Jim Crow segregation. We have the restoration of slave-like conditions, only this time they are entirely legal and in some ways are every bit as bad or worse in some communities than enslavement itself. Then in the 20s, you have the Great Migration. Black folks move north looking for jobs, don't want to be sharecroppers anymore, heading for industrial jobs. What are they met with? They're met with better opportunity. Yes, they're also met with race riots. You know, you have places like East St. Louis. You have places all around the country, mostly not in the South, where there are these orgies of racist violence where hundreds of people are killed in East St. Louis and other places as a response, as white rage. You have DSEG in 54, where Brown v. Board comes down. You have Southern schools that close down the school rather than integrate the school. That's a form of white rage. You have the Civil Rights era. You have the backlash then against affirmative action. You have Richard Nixon's Law and Order campaign using code language to justify racist policy, something that Lee Atwater, who until Karl Rove was probably our nation's best known Republican political consultant, sang on audio tape in 1981. You know, it used to be you could use the N-word, and of course he said it, I won't, but it used to be you could say that, now you can't say it, so we say states' rights, and we say crime, and we say welfare, you know, but really it's about hurting black people. This is something that he admits was their strategy. That's white rage. And then you have the Obama era. And again, putting aside how many steps forward this really was in substantive terms, and we could disagree about that and argue about it, certainly was substantive in the symbolic sense, if nothing else. And it was met with white rage immediately. It was met with the Tea Party, I want my country back, right, which is an interesting possessive form of the phrase, right? My country. We want our country, because white America has been led to believe that this, in fact, is ours, and everyone else serves at our pleasure and is here because we let them be. That happens almost immediately. The birther stuff starts almost immediately, which is fundamentally racist and ignorant, led by the man who will now take the place of the person whose legitimacy he did not believe. And so all of this is a form of white rage. What makes it especially dangerous, though, right now, is that in all of those other eras when that happened, it was sort of something that was trite about it, almost pathetic, right? Almost laughable. I mean, to say that whites are the victims of reverse discrimination in 1883, which, by the way, is what the Supreme Court of the United States said when they got rid of the post-emancipation civil rights laws. The one of the justices at the time, Joseph Bradley, said that it was time for the Negro to stop being the special favorite of the law. So they were actually using this rhetoric less than 20 years after enslavement. That was absurd, and we can all look at it and go, well, that's ridiculous. The difference is we're now in a country where that white rage or white anxiety, white resentment, whatever you want to call it, is a lot more potent. Why? Because we have a demographic shift afoot where within 30 years, half the country is going to be white, half's going to be people of color. That's freaking some people out who have to share the designation of an American with very different folks than what they were used to. The culture has shifted, right? Even if the economics haven't and the real power base hasn't, the multicultural popular culture is real. That's been the one area of significant change in this country. So much so, some of us are old enough in this room to remember when MTV, well, first when they played music, but also to remember that for a long time they wouldn't play music by black artists. That was 30 years ago. That has shifted. That culture has shifted. So now whiteness is no longer the sort of hegemonic center of the universe. As long as whiteness was hegemonic and never interrogated, white folks weren't flipping out. As soon as it became interrogated and we couldn't hide behind the veil of what you called individuality or individualism or our own sort of racelessness, now you've got folks sort of popping off. And that is what I think makes this moment more dangerous than all those other eras of white rage.
Does that mean that every white person is racist? Of course not. There have always been allies in the fight for social justice. However, the majority that remain silent in the face of racism are just as complicit. You know, when your friends or family members make racist statements and you say nothing? The question I have for you is, why do you not speak out?
Why most white people don't speak out against racism? How come all the other white people don't go so hard on the bad racist white people? Something comparable to how black people will work hard to debate any of the bad black people who are simply frustrated with white racism and oppression. Why don't white people speak out against their own like we do? Mainly the path of least resistance, you feel me? People tend to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That's like law number one. We do things that we're rewarded for, and we avoid things that we're punished for. And in order for white supremacy to survive, people who are for white supremacy are going to be rewarded. People who are against white supremacy are going to be punished. So for anyone who speaks in favor of white people, they get rewarded. Anyone who speaks out against white people, they get punished. And it doesn't matter what the race is of the person doing this talking. It could be a white person speaking for or against white people, black person speaking for or against white people. Either way, the way you get treated depends on what your response is and what you're saying.
Now, as far as I and quite a few people of color are concerned, your silence is giving tacit approval to racism. There are those that'll hear this and accuse me of stirring the pot and wonder why I can't leave well enough alone. I also hear, it happened so long ago, why can't you just get over it? I have to remind these folks that because of the social policies and laws enacted by this country's government, Jim Crow was the law of the land. And even though on paper a lot of these policies have been outlawed, they're still very much at play today with discriminatory practices. These are people who subscribe to the racist status quo and will bristle at the mere hint of being called a racist. You usually hear this as a response to any person of color that even dares to approach the subject. As black people, we're still fighting the field Negro versus house Negro narrative among ourselves.
Take, for example, a black person who speaks out against black people. This goes way back to slavery, those who lived in the house versus those who lived the field. Nowadays, it's usually black conservatives who will point the finger at other black folks and say, okay, you're the problem. That's why we're in the condition we're in. They shift the blame from white supremacy to supposed black moral or cultural inferiority. And of course, white folks buy this because it supports some of their ingrained racist beliefs. He either justifies their racist beliefs that they already had, or he helps them maintain their illusion that racism is over and that there are no racially based limits to your success in this world, and therefore any failings you have on your part are based on your own feelings, not a system of oppression. He might get called a sellout or an Uncle Tom by other black people, but that doesn't really matter because they don't hold the power. You know, they're not the ones who can actually hold him accountable. It's usually going to be a white person who's signing his paycheck at the end of the day. It's a white person who decides whether he gets promoted or not, whether he even has a job or not, 9 times out of 10. A lot of these dudes even have careers just speaking out against other black folks because white people will pull them out. Whenever something happens, they want to blame on white people, well, pull out the black conservatives.
And the way I figure it, for as long as we've been trying to have this conversation, since you're simply not listening to me or any other person of color, not really, except for those house Negroes that we just told you about that make you feel comfortable, what I've decided to do was bring in some voices of other white people in hopes that some of you will finally get it. Seems like the truth is easier to take when it comes from one of your own. Here's part of the problem.
Dear racist white people, oh my God, you've done it again. You know, I told myself when I released the video pertaining to Botham Jean that this stuff couldn't get any worse, but boy, was I wrong. It's tragic enough that Bo was shot in his own home doing absolutely nothing wrong. But rewind a couple weeks ago, we had Jamel Robertson killed. He was a security guard doing his job at a nightclub in Chicago. He held down someone who was shooting inside the club. When cops got there, they shot Jamel, a hero, and took his life. And on today, while people are celebrating the life of Jamel Robertson, we're talking about another shooting at the hands of a police officer. A young male named EJ in Hoover, Alabama, was at a mall. He had just returned home to celebrate Thanksgiving with his family. He's enlisted in the Army. Also the son of a police officer. There was an altercation at that mall, and somehow things were said that EJ was the shooter. See, there was a 12-year-old girl shot. There was an 18-year-old male shot. And EJ lost his life because, you know, he was the shooter. But 24 hours later, we found out that wasn't true at all. EJ never fired his weapon. EJ was an enlisted, legal gun-carrying citizen of the United States. And it seems that when you're a white male in America and you do that, it's a CCW. It's legal. But when you're a black male, they label it brandishing a weapon. And I keep seeing the same ignorant comment on every post that I go to. Black people, stop making everything about race. But don't you people see that this is, in fact, about race? It's about equality. It's about the fact that the media will spin things in any direction while black people are helplessly trying to get the truth out. Because people like you ignore it and run with what you see because it's on your television. Understand that everyone that says they're for you aren't always for you. Or maybe they are for you. And that's what makes you comfortable. They're good for you, but not everyone. But the America I live in, we got to be good for each other, not just some. I'll continue to use my voice and speak out until that changes. If you don't believe me, take a look at the comments that I posted along with this video. These are real live comments. And also go take a look at the continuous posts from several media outlets of the man who recently murdered his wife, who was pregnant, and their children. They're using a family photo of this white guy with his family that he murdered. How morbid is that? But when a black male is killed, they find anything to demonize them with, use the worst photo that they can find. Meanwhile, this man was enlisted in the military, but you don't see that photo anywhere. Wake up, man. This shit is tiring.
Some of you will hear this and say, well, he's suffering from white guilt, or it's not as bad as it used to be, or it's just a little racism. Just a little racism? That's like being a little pregnant. It's either racist or it's not. Trying to quantify the amount of racism in this country is another means of you not having to deal with it and telling us that it's just something that we've got to put up with. Now, don't get me wrong. As individuals, people have come a long way with interpersonal relationships, and that's a small sign of progress, but it's not enough. Not nearly enough. It's the systemic and institutional racism that needs to be dealt with. It's the policies that keep whites at an unfair and, frankly, unearned advantage for the last 399 years.
Wealth disparity's got nothing to do with merit, talent, intelligence, hard work, or investment strategies. It has to do with the fact that some folks had a head start. And that head start doesn't go away just because you pass the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act. In fact, let's understand the real basis of that head start. The government of the United States stepped in and created wealth for white folks. And this thing goes back an awful long ways. Actually goes back to the colonies in the 1630s and 1640s. The Headright program was a program that allowed male heads of household from England who came to the United States to claim 50 acres of land and the tools with which to work it for nothing, just for making the trip. Now you see, you give out 50 acres of land and some tools to black people, and we call that a handout. We call that welfare. We might even call that reparations. You give out 50 acres of land and some tools to white folks, we call it nation building. See how that works? Fast forward to the 1860s. Homestead Act of 1862 gets passed. What does it do? It gives out 240 million or more acres of land for virtually nothing to white families. People of color almost completely barred from being able to take advantage of it. There are 20 million white folks in this country today who are the direct descendants of those people who got Homestead Act benefits, many millions of them living on that land, living on those ranches, living on those farms, living in those houses. Not one of them has showed up in Washington, D.C. and said, you know what, I got to give this back because it seems to me that if I keep this property that the government made possible, that'd be like, what would that be like? What's the word? That'd be like socialism. So here, y'all can take this back because I didn't get it fair and square, you see, but no one does that. Fast forward to the 20th century, from the 1930s until the 1960s, the first 30 years of the Federal Housing Administration Home Loan Program. Add to that the VA Home Loan Program, added to that in the 1940s. What were these? These were government-created programs to subsidize indirectly by way of guaranteeing with taxpayer dollars private loans from banks. Prior to the creation of the FHA, banks would not lend money to working class people. Didn't matter what color you were. They just didn't want to do it because the risk was too great. So even if you were white, didn't matter. If you didn't have enough to pay like half the down payment up front and you could pay it off in 10 years, you weren't getting a mortgage. That was the way it was. The government steps, so there was no middle class. I mean, there just wasn't any. The government steps in, creates the FHA program, later the VA program. What do these do? They basically say, don't worry, if the borrowers default, it'll be backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury, which is to say the taxpayers of the United States. So you'll get your money back, or at least some portion of it. And that made the banks willing to lend to lower income and working class white families who previously would have had to rent, just like black and brown families. They wouldn't have been able to buy. But the problem was, in the first 30 years of that program, it was almost exclusively for whites. Because the underwriting criteria that the banks were using that was actually given to them by a quasi-public institution, right, known as the Home Ownership Lending Corporation. The underwriting criteria that they used basically made it impossible for people of color to get these loans, even though they were guaranteed with taxpayer money, including the money of black and brown taxpayers. But the way the criteria was written, 98% of all the loans went to white families. By 1960, 40% of all white family mortgages were being written under this one preferential policy. Government policy, $120 billion worth of housing equity loaned from the early 1940s, late 30s until the early 1960s at a time when people of color couldn't get in on that. $120 billion head start. And again, if you do that for people of color, that's affirmative action, that's racial preference, that's welfare, that's a handout. You do it for white folks, it's good macroeconomic policy. So you have the FHA, the VA program, even black and brown veterans excluded from the loans that were available under the VA program. You have the GI Bill, which in theory was available to all returning veterans after World War II in Korea, but in practice, the disproportionate benefits went to white veterans because if you were a veteran of color, the employers still had the right of refusal. They still had the right to not hire you, to discriminate against you on the basis of race. Their property rights as owners were given precedence over the right of those returning GIs to have jobs. You couldn't just go to any college if they didn't want to admit you, so people of color were still excluded even after they had served the country in the military. So you had all of these programs, Homestead Act, VA, FHA, GI Bill, go all the way back to the Headright system, all these things pumping literally hundreds of billions, one might say trillions of dollars worth of wealth into white folks' hands before people of color even got to the starting gate of wealth accumulation.
By the way, 2019 marks the 400-year anniversary of the first African slaves being kidnapped and brought to these shores. As I pointed out earlier, there have always been white people that fought with us against America's injustice, at great risk to themselves in a multitude of ways.
White people who speak for the interest and for the benefit of black folks. And what happens with us? Most white people in this country either feel they have an interest in maintaining white supremacy or at minimum not opposing it. Because when white people do take a stand, we get ostracized for it. And if you haven't seen that happen, it's probably just because white folks who speak out in the interest of black people rarely make it on TV. We don't get called in for the interviews.
What happens to some of our real allies amounts to white-on-white crime.
Anyone who identifies too closely with blacks, we get written off, laughed at, looked out as clowns. They come up with words. Back in the day, it was, N-word lover. They call us wiggers, you know, all these different words they have to dismiss and shut down white folks who get too close to black folks.
However, the majority that claim to be against racial injustice are merely paying lip service to the issue.
Sure, you got some white folks who will proclaim colorblind beliefs. They say we're not racist. On Martin Luther King Day, they all get around and sing Kumbaya, which is great. I'm not knocking that. But what I'm saying is, when it comes to actually challenging white supremacy in a real way or pointing out systemic injustices in this country, suddenly they're not around. Suddenly they don't want to speak about it. They opt out of the conversation. Most white folks. Or when they do go hard, they go hard on historical injustices. They go hard on slavery. They go hard on Jim Crow, segregation, but they don't go hard on current systemic injustice. Only time they speak out against what's happening right now is when they're going against extremists. The KKK, neo-Nazi, skinheads, they'll throw them under the bus. But all these people who subconsciously support white supremacy without even realizing it, they're left untouched. They always come to the defense, making excuses for them. And also the media always portrays this whole thing as a black problem as well, not taking into account the fact that the race problem in this country is actually a white problem.
Another problem I have with wannabe allies is this pathological need to dominate the conversation. You say you want a dialogue, but you simply refuse to shut up long enough to actually listen.
And it's funny because on one hand, you'll see the white saviorism mentality. You know, they got these movies coming out where it's the white people helping out the poor black people, you know, this paternalistic idea we have. But that's a fictionalized version. The actual white folks who really put themselves on the line and died for this, you never hear them mentioned. They don't talk about them in Black History Month. They don't talk about it when they're talking about the Civil Rights Movement. They don't talk about John Brown. I can't even name most of the white activists from the past. And me being who I am, I should know. Most of us don't even know because it's hard. You got to dig deep to find that. And I'll tell you why. It's because they don't want us to see that. They don't want us to identify with that. They don't want us to see that as an option for us.
Now, I understand that there will be some of you who'll hear this episode and walk away with hurt feelings. That's because you're taking what's being presented very personally. If that's the case, it may be time for you to take a long, hard look in the mirror. For the rest of you that are still here, stay tuned. If you're really sincere about wanting to step up in the fight against racism, we'll point you in the right direction right after this. If you're an advertiser, one of the most important things about getting your message out is actually standing out from the rest of the crowd. If you're listening to this program right now, this is where you'd hear your commercial. As an exclusive sponsor of Gunshots Straight from the Hip, your commercial is professionally produced and gets a longer shelf life based on your needs. Gunshots Straight from the Hip is a unique and compelling program unlike anything else in the marketplace. Episodes are available for download on iTunes, TuneIn, and MarkGunMedia.com. And depending on how you tailor your message, the potential for new and repeat customers is that much greater. Best of all, it's extremely cost-effective. If you'd like more information on how you can be a sponsor of this broadcast, call Mark Gun Media, Inc. at 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Or log on to markgunmedia.com. For downloads of this and past episodes and information about all the multimedia services we offer, log on to our website at www.markgunmedia.com. That's markgunmedia.com. Welcome back to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. In this episode, a conversation about race from white America to white America.
Ending systemic racism requires contributions from us all, especially those of us who haven't experienced it ourselves. We white Americans need to do a better job of listening when African Americans talk about the seen and unseen barriers you face every day. We need to recognize our privilege and practice humility rather than assume that our experiences are everyone's experiences. We all need to try as best we can to walk in one another's shoes, to imagine what it would be like to sit our son or daughter down and have the talk about how carefully they need to act around police because the slightest wrong move could get them hurt or even killed.
It's been my experience that the one thing that whites on average get wrong And what causes them to become so defensive when talking about racism?
We constantly think of race as like this big monster, that what we have to do is seek out these like Klan members and win them over one at a time, and then magically racism is going to go away.
Gone away.
That to me is much more disheartening and much more of a negative outlook because that's not possible.
No, it's not going to
It's not a good use of time.
No, it's counterproductive.
It is, and it will have no impact on the system in the end. And instead of thinking that we're in this battle for individual hearts and minds of every single racist in the world, and instead we're in a battle to deconstruct systems of white supremacy.
I've heard many white people say that racism is always going to be around and there's nothing that can be done about it. Now that only serves to amplify the anger within an already angry Black America. After all, racism isn't a problem that we created in this country, but it is one that we continue to suffer the effects of.
Imagine on a pretty consistent basis, you can't get a f***ing cab, even though you're a neurosurgeon, because you're black. Every person of color in this country has faced an indignity, from the ridiculous to the grotesque to the sometimes fatal, at some point in their, I'm going to say last couple of hours, because of their skin color. Quick story. Recently, we sent a correspondent and a producer to a building where we were going to tape an interview. The producer, white, dressed in what could only be described as homeless elf attire, and a pretty strong 5 o'clock from the previous week's shadow, strode confidently into the building, preceding our humble correspondent, a gentleman of color, dressed resplendently in a tailored suit. Who do you think was stopped? Let me give you a hint, the black guy. And that happens all the time, all of it. Race is there, and it is a constant. You're tired of hearing about it? Imagine how exhausting it is living it.
People often ask me why I'm so focused on racism, and they've even accused me of being racist as well. Another diversionary tactic by those that simply don't want to deal with the problem.
I want every white person in this room who would be happy to be treated as this society in general treats our black citizens. If you, as a white person, would be happy to receive the same treatment that our black citizens do in this society, please stand. You didn't understand the directions. If you white folks want to be treated the way blacks are in this society, stand. Nobody's standing here. That says very plainly that you know what's happening. You know you don't want it for you. I want to know why you're so willing to accept it or to allow it to happen for others.
I remain focused on dealing with racism in the way that I do because of a very real and potentially destructive anger. So yeah, I could be labeled as that scary black man that racists fear would exact a very well justified vengeance on a society that continues to cause as much harm as white America has. However, I choose to use the talents I have to provoke thoughts and conversations. The overall premise of this episode was not to address those that we know that are racist and continue to whine about being called on their racism, even when they proudly proclaim that they are racist. This episode is for those of you who sit quietly on the sidelines, doing nothing, saying nothing. And I simply want to know why.
If we look at it like black folks stand up for black folks, white folks, all we have to do is just quote unquote not be racist and just go about living our lives in comfort. Well, this is what happened. Black folks get the impression that we don't care because of what they go through every day and what we continuously fail to acknowledge. Or even if we do acknowledge, we fail to do anything about it or speak out actively against it. And then white folks, because we don't see other white folks standing up for it, we get the impression that it's not our battle. We're not told the story that it's our battle. You know, and the cycle just keeps continuing. Hell, I've even got people close to me, people who I know are not racist in their heart, who preach humanitarian values. They've told me this is not my battle. Why are you fighting this? People I know and love. And when otherwise well-meaning white folks tell me that this isn't my fight, I ask you a question. Why the f*** isn't it yours?
You've been listening to Gunshots Straight from the Hip. The views expressed are those of the host and guests and not reflective of any business entity or anyone associated with this broadcast. If you have any comments or want more information on how to be a sponsor, log on to our website at markgunmedia.com or call us at 502 502-407-0283. That's 502-407-0283. Thank you for listening.
Mark Gun Media. No hype, no hoopla, just damn good work.